Hi, my name is Susan Banducci and I'll be giving our presentation on who governs the COVID-19 pandemic and perceptions of national and local government. In order to keep the presentation to 12 minutes, I'll speak only briefly to each slide, but you should be able to pause the presentation in order to read the complete slide. Trust is crucial for compliance and government policy responses during the pandemic. Higher levels of trust are associated with compliance with a number of measures during the pandemic, and a trusting citizenry also allows governments to take policy risks and act quickly, and it is also correlated with lower mortality rates. What motivates trust during a pandemic? There have been two arguments in the current pandemic about the increased levels of trust that have been seen in countries across the globe. One explanation is about a rally effect, and that the increased levels of trust and support for the government are in response to anxiety and uncertainty about the crisis. However, Boll et al. Argue that the increased levels of trust that they found in Western Europe are due to governments acting quickly and instituting restrictions in order to curb the spread of the virus. So that trust and increases in trust are actually related to the performance of governments and not a rally effect. There is also a difference and a reason to look at the differences between national and local levels of trust, as different levels of government are responsible for managing the crisis. In the UK, it's been argued there's been a centralization in the approach to COVID, and that is largely due to the government's lack of trust in local authorities. Nevertheless, it's important to look at differences in how people perceive how national and local governments are managing the crisis and individuals' trust in those institutions, because local trust is not simply a proxy for trust in national governments. What we expect to find when we look at the development of trust and performance over the pandemic and over the past 10 months in the UK is that trust will become a function of performance evaluations as the rally effect declines. We also expect to see any political effects in trust to decline as performance evaluations increase. We also, though, expect to see differences in national and local evaluations that will be driven by national level issues such as Brexit, which will be important for national but not local evaluations, and then identities at the national and local level will be important in explaining differences. However, we expect trust in local governments to become more politicized over time as local authorities take more action to manage COVID, and they may be affected by just an overall change in the dynamics of COVID. We use a two-wave panel survey. The first wave was conducted in July at the end of a period of easing of lockdown restrictions after the first national lockdown in March. And then we were in the field with the second wave of the panel survey and re-interviewed over 3,500 respondents. And we were in the field during the announcement of the second national lockdown, and our field work followed the Burnham and Manchester rebellion on the 22nd of October. So there's reasons to expect, again, increased politicization of local measures of trust due to that. The main dependent variables that we're interested in is trust, measuring trust in local councils and national governments. High values indicate high trust, and then we've constructed an index about how local and national governments have been handling the pandemic across how they evaluations of how they managed NHS demand, social care, lockdown, and schools. And for this index, it's been rescaled so that 1 indicates it's been managed very well and 0 indicates it's been managed very badly. Then we have, as our independent variables, the impact of COVID on daily activities, the number of activities that, or ways in which individuals have said they've been impacted by COVID, so that's a count. Then we have personal financial position, retrospective evaluations. Then we have the actual number of COVID cases in the postcode area in which people live, party identification and leave, anger about the impact of COVID on Brexit, news consumption at the local and national levels, how important identities are, about identities and the sense of identity about where people live, their ethnicity, and then Britishness. Again, that's to pick up differences in local and national identities. And then we have indicators of the political context, the share of seats held by Conservatives in the local council, and whether individuals live in a Labour-held metro mayor area. And then we control for a number of socio-demographics. This just illustrates the different items that go into the index of our performance index, and about how local and national governments are handling the pandemic. And that is, in fact, the first outcome or first dependent variable that we predict. And we look at whether or not the impact of performance indicators increases between waves, whether political variables decline, and what the difference is between local and national identities and their impact on evaluations of performance. And this is just to show that both national and local government handling declined between waves, so people became more negative about how both the national and local governments were handling the pandemic. We estimate mixed effects models within subjects with random effects at both the area, postcode area, and the individual level. And here we just plot the coefficients for the first wave in green and the second wave in orange for both the national level evaluations and the local level evaluations of how individuals think that they're performing in managing COVID. And just to highlight that there's the economic situation is important in explaining national level performance, not so much local level performance, but that the personal impact of COVID is important to explaining local level performance. And it became more important in the second wave. So the greater the impact that COVID has on your personal situation, the more negative your evaluation is of local government, but it has no impact on national government. In terms of political variables, leavers are more positive about national government performance, as are Conservative Party identifiers, and then and they're more positive about national performance. In terms of local level performance, there's a dynamic there between waves. Conservatives became more positive about local performance in the second wave, but it has a negative impact on local performance in the second wave if you're a leaver. I should also say that both for local and national level performance, if you're angry about Brexit, it's had a negative impact on performance. Also then, to point out the impact of identities, local area identity has a negative impact or a positive impact on local performance and no significant impact on national performance. But British identity is important and significant at both the national and the local level. And this just illustrates the predicted level of performance evaluations for different categories. And this is just to highlight that the impact of COVID or I'd like to highlight how the impact of COVID, personal impact of COVID, has reduced local level evaluations such that in the second wave, so that they're almost equal with national level evaluations. And that's considerable, given that national level evaluations were much more negative than local level evaluations. However, we see the opposite is true with economic situations. It has a more negative impact on national level evaluations than on local level evaluations. And then finally, we turn to the impact of performance on trust in government and look at whether or not performance evaluations increase across the waves as the rally effect declines, and whether or not political and identity indicators have an impact on trust beyond their impact on performance evaluations. And this is just to show that there was a change in the mean level of trust between wave 1 and wave 2, and this was mainly for the government and not local council. But you can also see there was a decline in trust amongst scientists and an increase in trust amongst the police, but also a decline in trust for the European Union as well. But we focus on government and local council trust, and we estimate similar models to what we saw for performance measures, but we include the performance measure in predicting trust. And you can see that that overwhelmingly has the largest impact on explaining trust. But there's a bigger impact of the performance measures on national trust than there is on local trust. So that overall performance measure, the index of evaluations of how governments are managing, again, is more has a bigger impact at the national than at the local level. But we can also see that there is more impact of local area identities on trust beyond that performance measure. And we also see that partisanship and also anger about Brexit and COVID have effects on national levels of trust beyond that performance measure. So those are just a couple of the effects that I wanted to highlight in the presentation. And of course, there will be an opportunity for questions about other results next week. And just some preliminary conclusions about how there seems to be more dynamic in the support for local governments across the waves in our survey than there is in the national measures. And we might interpret this again as an increased politicization of local government performance over the course of the pandemic in the UK. But there are still some indicators of trust beyond the performance measures, which is also important to conclude. So again, we look forward to hearing your thoughts next week at the conference.